I'm happy to be here, and I think, seeing Austin and Darby, at least, these two, it makes me think that Gen Z has a lot of things going for it. I've had that feeling for a long time as I've been teaching. It seems like the upper crust, at least, of Gen Z is very impressive, and I think both Austin, Darby, and other gentlemen who are up here in suits and ties, I'm very happy to see such respectable young men and women here. And so my talk today is called Compulsory Feminism. It's based on an article that I published in First Things, which is, a pretty good, not bad journal of religion and politics in America. And although I'm going to depart from it a little bit and try to give a little bit more context for it. So here we go. So it's not a real secret. I think it's true that men and women have generally in the main, different talents, interests, and personalities. And one of the things that every society has to do is find a way of reconciling those different interests, personalities, and proclivities and talents. And really throughout the ages, the best way whereby the differences between men and women have been reconciled is through this thing we call marriage, where men and women each make unique contributions to achieve the goals of marriage. Sometimes that means that women are more welcoming and they welcome people into the household, and men have more like standards and rules and they think about making sure everyone is acting appropriately. Or women have children and men provide. These are all deep and true and general truths about men and women. And marriage is the kind of good enough way that we seek as a society to reconcile those interests to one another. And I would say that this is a historical norm. It's very difficult to find a political community that hasn't emphasized marriage as a way of reconciling these two things. And it leads to amazing things like children who are not only brought into the world, but then raised up to honorable or respectable adulthood. And I think we're seeing more and more every day, that when you compromise that particular way of translating the differences between men and women, that is, when you dishonor marriage, you're going to actually get fewer marriages, you're going to actually get fewer children, and you're going to actually get, in many ways, more social problems that follow from those two previous facts. So, and I think feminism is one of the contributing causes to the widespread dishonoring and kind of falling out of practice in marriage. Somewhere like in the late 50s, 90% of adults over the age of 18 were married. Now the number is kind of in the mid-50s. Right? That's a big societal change. Back in the 50s, the total fertility rate was above 4. Now, it's below like 1.75 in that area in America. In some countries, it's below 0.7. It's an amazing thing. And the air kind of is coming out of the balloon on these matters. I don't think feminism is the only thing to trace these social problems to. Certainly economic factors factor in, though those aren't unrelated to feminism generally. Certainly the wide acceptance of alternative lifestyles, so-called, are contributing factors. Certainly divorce and its easy access are contributing factors. But I want to insist that feminism is one of the contributing factors. And the reason for that is almost a simple logical proposition kind of based on the initial premise. Feminism is about cultivating a new kind of woman with a different understanding of her interests and her personality and her talents. And that woman, as the great feminist thinkers from Beauvoir to today emphasize, is the independent woman. Okay? Family life and marriage are about mutual dependence. They're inescapably about mutual dependence of one on another. When you cultivate a spirit of independence, you're going to get less mutual dependence. QED, the problem that feminism poses for the family. So that's kind of the underlying thesis of the talk, and I want to give some caveats to make sure that everyone knows what I'm not arguing, and then I'll try to hit the meat of the compulsory feminism ethos as it is. First of all, as I say, some caveats. I'm not here to advocate the taking away of anyone's rights. I'm not opposed to opportunities for men or women. I am, however, as I say, an anti-feminist, which leads me to my second caveat. What does it mean to be an anti-feminist? Are there prominent anti-feminists today? Often, they're bad guys. I think the world's most famous anti-feminist is Andrew Tate, who I think is more famous for using up women for his prostitution rings and such. So Andrew Tate is an anti-feminist. Scott Yenor is anti-feminist. Therefore, is Scott Yenor arguing for Andrew Tate's lifestyle? I want to say no, and point to other prominent anti-feminists in the history of feminist thought. I would say I'm much closer to someone like Phyllis Schlafly, God rest her soul, who died in 2016 and was the great anti-feminist of the last half of the 20th century. And this will become obvious as we go through. But obviously, there are many species of different ways of approaching this. And my species is nothing like, I think, Andrew Tate. You might even think that I'm a little more puritanical than Andrew Tate is, and advocate perhaps for being a one-woman man instead of a one-woman-at-a-time man. A second thing, or a third thing I should say, is obviously there are individual differences. That is, not all women are the same, not all men are the same. It looks to me like, given the data that you can see across culture, that about 3/4 of women would prefer to watch their children during their infancy, for instance. I think that is like a good rule of thumb. Before the children go off to school or something, like about 3/4 of women around the world would rather prioritize motherhood and wifeliness during those years than career, but that means obviously that would leave 1/4 that wouldn't want to do that. And these individual differences are something that's difficult to wrestle with in any particular society, and our society is no different. So all of those things I take as caveats, but I should say, like, in addition to that, no matter what, we live in a political community that entertains certain assumptions about what men and women would do, what a good life is, how they should prioritize work and family and other things. We live in what I call a sexual constitution. A sexual constitution is a broadly approved set of honor and shame that tells us what a good person is, what a good life is, and informs, though never dictates, a particular life approach to life. So back in the day, let's say back in the before the 1960s, before feminism became a prominent ideology, if you were 21 and you weren't married, mothers were saying, well, what's wrong? Can't you find a good guy? Do you have a bad reputation? There was nothing that was forcing anyone to say that. It was a sexual constitution that we had that shaped our expectations about what men and women would do and be. And it was enforced by just public opinion, a nag here, a hint there, but always, but never through the laws, or rarely through the laws, usually through public opinion. And today, we probably have a different kind of sexual constitution. Imagine a 20-year-old getting married in college. Well, what kind of pressure does that 20-year-old face? In 1950, it would have been like, oh, of course you're getting married. You should be getting married. Now it's like, you need to live first. you're giving up on all the important things of life. You need to live. Now, no one is preventing them from getting married. They're still free, but a sexual constitution kind of puts forward a system of honor and shame that gently nudges people in one direction or in a different direction. And feminism is an essential element to our sexual constitution. So it subtly, not through force, although like maybe a little bit through force, as we'll get to later on, shapes the expectations that people have for their lives. So if you drift along and never make a decision, you'll end up living your life according to a particular life script that you didn't write, that has been written. It's written in our laws, it's written in our customs, it's written in public opinion, and you'll drift along in that particular direction. You can see this. I mean, there's plenty of stats to prove this. It's not really a controversial statement, I think. Like, what's the average age of getting married in America? For women, it's 29. For men, it's 31. What is the average age of college graduates for getting married? For women, it's 30. For men, it's 32. Having first kid, like it's, once again, the numbers are slightly different, but it's higher. They usually have them within marriage. Like, that's just historically very weird. Here's another question for you. At what age are young women most fertile? Does anyone know? It's illegal, actually, to say this, so I'm not going to say it. But if I heard someone once say, 18 to 25. So just like add that up. Our average age of first marriage or first baby is 30, somewhere between 29 and 33, depending on education status and other things. Outside the range of when like people are most able to do it. So like that has downstream effects, but it's, as I say, part of our sexual constitution, and it shouldn't be a surprise that we are living with like these new realities as our lives are being shaped by it. Once again, are you free? Can you get married at 18? Yes. Can you have a baby at 18? Yes, you are free to do it. But the sexual constitution is a system of shame and honor that nudges people in particular directions and away from other directions. That sound good? All right. Now, feminism did not, drop down, full grown from the head of Zeus, and it emerged in our situation. I'm sorry, my microphone fell off. It emerged in our situation, and it's I would say, a natural outgrowth of modern approaches to life. I like to say these things for my first book. This is the topic of my first book. And here's what I mean by that. The early modern thinkers, like at the time of the Reformation, gave philosophy, and hence public philosophy, a new direction. And the goal, they said, was to conquer nature. We want to discover the ways in which nature works, and then harness the ways of nature to increase human power in relationship to nature. So in the beginning, they discovered things like iron and steel, which comes from like the mixing of various minerals, and like using nature's powers to find ways of building stronger buildings. And then they learned how to make bricks. And then they learned a little bit about health. And over the course of time, man has become more and more powerful in relation to nature so that we can split the atom and create great and powerful ways of powering cities and bombs and things like this. It's awesome. Well, an outgrowth of the desire to conquer nature is the desire to conquer human nature, to change the way nature operates. It was always thought that men and women would be different. How did we know? Open your eyes and look. But the modern approach to nature is we don't have to settle for the stupid stuff of nature. We can take what nature has given us and harness it and change it and make the world what we want it to be. It was always thought, for instance, that human babies would come from procreation. Boy meets girl, and the boy and girl drink wine. One thing leads to another, and you have children. That's the process, the natural process. But there's no reason for us to sit still with the natural process, to accept the deliverances of the natural process. We can, first of all, interrupt it so that every time boy meets girl, they can't have a child. Contraception is an outgrowth of the modern desire to conquer nature, right? The idea of, surrogacy is a kind of old idea, but it's another way of expressing this. We can genetically engineer children. We can grow them in iron wombs. These policies or these proposals were often made in especially the 1960s and 1970s versions of feminism. Certainly they're also widely heard today, because conquering the process of birth is part of conquering nature. And conquering nature can be put in the service of erasing the differences between men and women, or at least making them less important to human life. So in that sense, when Niccolò Machiavelli was announcing the desire to conquer fortune, and Francis Bacon in 1620 was talking about relieving man's estate and conquering nature and stretching her and making her deliver forth for man, he wasn't thinking about feminism. But naturally, feminism grows out of this modern desire to conquer nature. And one other element of this, in modern thought, human relations are reconceived in terms of contract. So we will join into a family if you say yes and you say yes. And then if you decide eventually you want to say no or you want to say no, you can get out of the marriage. It's a contract, not a sacrament and not a covenant, which suggests that human beings would be in communal relation with one another. We tried to reconceive of all human relations in terms of contracts. In politics, we conceived of this idea that political communities are established by social contracts, where everyone agrees to join a country and has the right, if they want, to quit that country. We conceived of marriage and family life in terms of contract too, and also churches. Churches were voluntary institutions that could be entered into and leave because they're contracts. Well, it's hard to imagine any of these institutions ultimately being reconceived simply in terms of contract. But the idea that we should conceive of these institutions in terms of contracts makes something like the hostility between men and women in marriage naturally, it allows it to naturally arise. Here's what I mean by that. If you're in a marriage because it serves your interests, and the other person is in the marriage because it serves your interests, and your interests are not transformed by joining the marriage, then eventually the thing is difficult to hold together. So feminism is a way of teaching women what their interests are that have been different than it was in the past. Men are changed too under those circumstances. They come to have a new understanding of their interests, and these interests ultimately are more difficult to reconcile with one another as a result of this way of thinking. So, as I say, this mode of thought isn't something that you say, well, the 60s, darn it, the 60s. If it wasn't for the 60s, we'd be better off. No, it's way worse than that. This mode of thought is kind of inevitable once you have abandoned a sacramental or a communal understanding of political communities, of churches, and of families. And so we're dealing with like a downstream effect of the abandonment of those particular approaches to human life. All right, but once again, but this is not to absolve feminism or say that it has nothing to do with it. I want to get to the topic of compulsory feminism, if that's okay. So the compulsory feminism is what we would call modern feminism. It is enshrined in law and custom during the 60s, really through the 1990s. And it also compromises, it expresses, it radicalizes these modern tendencies that I talked about. And it represents the legal effort to reconstruct sexual relations differently than they had been in the past. Now, almost none of us, I mean, I'm surveying this quickly. I might be the oldest guy in the room. Let's assume I'm the oldest guy in the room. I'm 53. This means that if I'm close to the oldest guy in the room, that none of us have lived under a regime that wasn't compulsory feminism. We don't know what the world was like before compulsory feminism. At least we've never experienced it. So it's kind of difficult to recover these things. And it also should tell you a little something, that it's impossible to return to that world. If no one remembers the world and can't even give an account of what it was like, you can't go back. You can only go forward. We're not crabs who are the only animals that walk backwards. The world before compulsory feminism cannot be revived. It's dead. Doornails are like more alive than that world, I guess. That's not entirely true. We'll get to it a little bit. So what were the elements of life before compulsory feminism? Right, I'm going to give you like a couple things, and I'll try to describe what they are, and then I'll try to show what about the feminist constitution made those things illegal. All right, one element of the world before feminism is something called the family wage. Okay, now the family wage is part of Catholic social teaching, but it was also really part of American political practice. And what it meant is that married men with children would be paid more than unmarried men without children. Because bosses saw their job and unions negotiated contracts on the basis that this is the breadwinner for a family. This makes sense? So even under industrial relations, like when we had large corporations and such, people, I mean, like estimates vary, somewhere between 60 and 80 are the numbers I've seen, percent of employers paid family wages before the 1960s, okay? And what that, as I say, what that means is that an employer is looking at an employee and seeing more than an employee, but seeing a representative of a family, perhaps a head of a household, but definitely more than an employee. And an employer who felt obliged to support that person in the endeavor of being a head of household could pay that person more. That was, as I say, a pretty common practice in the American economy before 1960. Another practice that was very common is public support for the idea that men and women would do different things within the family. Now, like what that means several different things. Like some states, including Idaho, had laws that assumed, but it was rebuttable, that the men would be like organizing the finances of a family. So he would be responsible, like he himself would be responsible if the family went bankrupt or if his wife ran up credit card bills. Sorry, that probably never happens, but maybe it could happen, right? And he would be legally on the hook for that kind of stuff, right? Because of the assumption, rebuttable, that he was in charge of such things. Or if a kid died, who would be the owner of the kid's property? That was often settled in law, father or mother. It really, like, it could have been either way, but it was usually the father. And that was also true here in Idaho. There would be, as I say, public support for these things. But there would also be, and here's the kind of scandalous thing, businesses could actually decide that they didn't want to hire mothers of young children. Very common practice in American economics before 1971. I'll get to this in a second. Which, here's what I mean. Like, a business owner would say, I think it's important. I want to support my employees as they build families. And a business owner would say, I'm not going to take a mother away from a child. So they would have prohibitions on hiring women with children under 5. So very common until 1971. We'll talk about this in a second. Employers could offer different mothers and fathers, men and women, different deals based on the employer's idea of how he could support the work that men and women would do in the family. Okay? Famous case. Martin Marietta versus Phillips. It was decided by the Supreme Court in 1971, put an end to this. But I guess let me describe all the things. Then we'll talk about how each of them have been made illegal under the compulsory feminist constitution. So what have I said so far? Family wage, public support for different roles between men and women, private or economic support for different roles between men and women that you'd see companies give. Last thing is that there was public enforcement of modesty and responsibility for men and women. Once again, this is a nudge, not a law. And what I mean by that is there would be men who would drop the ball in their family, wouldn't get hired, and would become outcasts in particular neighborhoods or employers. Or men who womanized would end up actually having trouble at work. Women who were seductive, tried to seduce people, would have trouble at work. There was enforcement for modesty. There were rules about renting a hotel when you're not married. Just an attempt in the public to enforce modesty and to channel sex into marriage as opposed to celebrate its expression. Now, these are all elements of, you may like them, you may not like them. A lot of people like the family wage, say, oh, that sounds like a good idea. A lot of countries are trying to revive the family wage, but doing it at the back end and not the front end by giving tax credits and housing credits to people who are married and have kids. We're trying to, in some ways, re-engineer some of the support we used to give. But it's always it's more difficult, and we've found out it actually doesn't work for the most part. But once again, we'll get to that in a second. So what happened to the family wage? Now, if I say something like equal pay for equal work, well, that's something everyone in the room would embrace and say, oh, that's a good idea. But just recognize that that principle makes the family wage illegal. Because the family wage actually stands for the idea that unequal pay for equal work, if the employer wants. The Equal Pay Act, which was passed in 1963, made any effort to offer economic support for families at the level of the business illegal. Ruled it out of bounds. So if I wanted to be a supportive of my employees, I'd be fined, or I'd be paying back pay, or maybe collecting from the person I overpaid. And then, well, what happens to the family wage after the Equal Pay Act? No one does it, unless you have under 15 employees. But good luck if you do that, if you have under 15 employees. So the family wage is made illegal by the Equal Pay Act. And that's an element of what I'm calling compulsory feminism. Another element of that is that the state could no longer support the idea that men and women do different things within marriage. You could never have a law that assumes that women will take care of children in their youngest years. You have to have, everything has to be kind of gender neutral. And when it comes to state laws. So the laws that I mentioned before about men being responsible for financial bankruptcy, that's gone. That would be discriminatory. So now both are treated as one in law, which has a certain justice to it, I suppose. Interestingly, no employer could ever support the idea that young mothers should, oversee their children's development in the first 2 years or 1 year or 6 months. You cannot do it. This is the famous Martin Marietta versus Phillips case of 1971. Martin Marietta, you guys probably heard of it. It's a defense contractor. And they were kind of conservative guys. They I think, were kind of genuinely committed to what later came to be known as family values. And they had a policy against hiring mothers with children under 5. And after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, employers were not allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex. That was interpreted, and kind of no one really took it that seriously until this case, when even the lower court said, yeah, Martin Marietta should do that because men and women have different responsibilities in the home. And if an employer wants to support that idea of different responsibilities, they should be able to support that idea of different responsibilities. They're not required to do it, but they're free to do it. Well, the Supreme Court said no. Martin Marietta cannot not hire Miss Phillips. And the reasoning was that no employer can ever have a vision of how a family should operate incorporated into their employment, promotion, working conditions, or whatever. And since 1971, they've expanded the number of businesses that are under this particular regulation, so it's 15 or under employees. So if you think about it, there are religious exemptions, so I don't want to use Catholic Charities or something like that as an example. But let's say you run a magazine, in New York City, and it's a magazine that's dedicated to pursuing the idea of religion in the public square. Let's call it First Things. And you have 17 employees, and every one of them is some sort of right-wing Catholic. And a mother of 4 is your editor. You want to give her you want to keep her, she's very valuable. You want to give her very flexible working conditions so that she can get her editing done at night, 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. between feedings, whatever. You want to do something like that. And a guy who's in your employ, who's your development guy, wants that deal. I'd like to be able to do my development for First Things and raise money between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. And I would like the same deal. If you have over 15 employees, you can do it, unless you want to kind of risk the entire civil rights regime coming down on you, and if not putting you out of business, going through sufficient legal shenanigans to compromise your operations. So basically, no matter how small your business is, you're not allowed to support families the way you'd like. That's compulsory feminism. Now, once again, it's not something that that operates actually on the level of law. That operates on the level of law. But there are informal ways which the same kind of compulsion could come about in just normal life. This week is the Masters. I don't know how many of you guys watch the tradition unlike any other. My favorite sporting event is the Masters. And for the longest time, Augusta National, where the Masters is held, was a male-only club. Is it legal to have a male-only club? Does anyone know? Are you allowed to do that? Yes, you are allowed to do it. Over the course of maybe, it was from 2003 to 2011, I did the count on this. The New York Times ran over 800 stories during those years about the male-only nature of Augusta, always interviewing the advertisers, Cadillac, Rolex, IBM, asking them how they could continue to support a discriminatory institution like that, such that Augusta National, which is kind of a good old boy thing down there in Augusta, like they said, it's not worth the headache. So they let Condoleezza Rice in. And I don't know how many women are members now, but like the public pressure follows the law. Is it legal to have single-sex public institutions of higher ed? Anyone know? No, illegal. Virginia versus United States, 1997. VMI, Virginia Military Institute, put out of business. I take that back. It wasn't put out of business. It was integrated because they favored a confrontational style of education, which, I don't know, have anyone seen Full Metal Jacket? The old movie. I always assume that it's a little like that, like in your face, yelling, demeaning, and with the goal of cultivating gentlemen. If you looked at their code, it was pretty inspiring from some perspective. And that was the code. It was thought that adding women to the mix would make it worse. Like, you wouldn't be able to do that stuff. And they found one woman who liked to be yelled at. She sued to get in. And the Supreme Court, I think it was 7-1, said, yeah, you're right, this is a violation. You can't have single-sex public institutions. VMI integrated. I think the competitive model of education lasted 3 years, and now it's like better than, well, all right. It's different. It's different than it used to be, as people who go there will tell you. So, and as studies show that they've done, alumni groups have done. So that's another element of compulsory feminism. There cannot be publicly sponsored male-only spaces built on the assumption that men need something different than women out of educational institutions. There are a couple that have survived. They almost all are heavily minority and thought to kind of aim at the most needed, the most vulnerable members of our society, but certainly no prestigious institution like VMI was. All right, last element of the compulsory feminism constitution that we have, and that is the hostile work environment standard for evaluating workplaces and education institutions. How are we doing on time? I don't see a clock.
We're 44 minutes in.
Oh, wow. I promised you 40 minutes. I'm going to stop in the middle of a sentence here shortly, but I'll make this somewhat quick. How's that? Now, it's somewhat of a controversy. Where does the hostile work environment standard for sexual harassment come from? I think of it as a natural outgrowth of the effort to stamp out discrimination in employment. Here's why. You could, as an employer, not have discriminatory practices when it comes to hiring. But then you could find the people you want to get rid of and make their lives miserable. And get rid of them not on the front end by not hiring them, but on the back end by making their lives miserable. So it's not shocking that jurisdictions that have very aggressive anti-sex discrimination statutes would eventually turn to adopt the hostile work environment idea of sexual harassment, which means that you're getting rid of the people by making, as I say, their lives miserable, instead of just not hiring them. Okay, does this make sense? And how do you determine what is and is not a hostile work environment? Well, it has to be done by the subjective perception of the person who is in that environment. Like, what do they say their experience is? If they say it's hostile, you have to prove to me that it's not. That's the legal standard. There's some great cases involved in this. My favorite is from the early 80s. There was a particular professor who was denied tenure at Boston University. And, I say nothing about the merits of the case. She was denied tenure. And all the way up, department, college, provost, president, board, everyone said no. She sued. Why did she sue? The president of Boston University at the time, John Silber, was kind of a known, a weird guy, like a conservative Democrat, often spoke at think tanks, and he gave a speech saying that one of the reasons kids are doing worse in education settings is that moms spend less time with them. All right. She sued to get tenure. Part of her case, like I don't know how much, 70% of her case was that speech. Silber had created a hostile work environment. And what's the evidence for that? President, provost, college, department, all said no. Why did they say no? They think it's impossible to balance these two things. So saying that the family is important creates a hostile work environment. It's a tough one. That's why you can't say what the ages of women being most fertile are if you want to make sure you're immune from hostile work environment claims. She won, got tenure. I don't know how long she lasted there. That part of the story I don't know, but that would be an interesting question. And that sets kind of the tone for the regulation of the workplace. Because now employers have to make sure that employees do not accidentally create a hostile work environment for other employees. So, what does an employer do in order to make sure that he can be safe from such lawsuits? You build large human resource departments with lots of trainings to show that you go the extra mile to make sure that your workplace is, as we say in some places, respectful. But we would just say not creating a hostile work environment. So this is another element of compulsory feminism, privatized enforcement of federal values. The enforcement is by employers, but they do it out of fear of what would happen in litigation if they didn't do it. So we all have had to change, and you can look at the numbers on this, human resources wasn't even a word until the 50s. And it became a real industry after these decisions in the mid-'80s that were made about the hostile work environment. So we have this constitution of compulsory feminism. And these are elements of it, as I say, you're still free to get married. You're not really free to hire how you want, actually. And you're really not free to run your workplace the way you want. So I guess somebody's rights are being taken away. But the whole idea is that we're constructing the environment in order to stamp out what some people think of as discrimination. And what's the effect? Well, I would say that the effect is all the things we talked about at the beginning. Lower marriage rates, difficult in establishing families. Family formation is delayed. Having babies is delayed. And it's baked into these particular assumptions that we cannot have an economy or a workplace that supports families in doing their business. So it's kind of like a closed circle. There are other elements to what compromises family life, but an important element, an inescapable element, are these elements of the sexual constitution that I call compulsory feminism. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention. Thanks. And I think we're going to take questions being written down on note cards. So if you have questions, just flash your note card. This one is an easy one. Should fathers automatically be paid more than single childless men, even if their work is worse? No. But the point that I'm trying to make, if I can maybe elaborate on that, is that employers are prohibited from paying a high-performing father more than a high-performing single. They're prohibited from doing it. So that's the crucial element of the law. I would suggest that people who are poor, or if their work is worse, you should consider firing them, if you can find a jurisdiction where that's possible. You can feel free to read them out. I mean, if you need to.
What time in American history did family life flourish the most in your view and why?
Yes, I mean, in a way, I think that's an easy question because I would look at various statistics to demonstrate the health or lack of health in that particular time. And the 1950s were a time when religious practice in America was the highest that it had ever been. It's never been as high as it was in the 50s, before or after. Family formation was kind of unbelievably high, like almost, you've never been able to find stats like it. 90% of people over the age of 18 were married. Fertility rates were high, and survival rates were high, it's a nice combo when you can get those two. And fertility rates were higher in the 1800s, but you had like lots of death. And so fertility rates were high in the 1950s. Divorce rates were very low. And also, it's remarkable that there was a culture that kind of supported it. It's fun to watch like Alfred Hitchcock movies or Westerns from the 50s. Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is kind of at the end of this era, but there's plenty of good movies from that time. And there's actually an effort to support the idea that men and women do different things and that both of them are noble. And both of them are to be honored. And it's usually understood in the context of the Christian faith. So since then, and in a way, this is hard to believe in some ways, but we still live off the fat of that decade. We still live off the fat of that decade. America's way less bad than other modern countries on all of these measures. Way less bad. Korea did not have the 50s. Their marriage rate is half of what ours is. Their birth rate is less than half of what ours is. The only country that rivals us in this respect is France. And Germany, way worse off. Sweden, way worse off, or at least pretty worse off, not as way. So in America, the 50s were the height. And as I say, we still live off the fat of that. I think of this often on the context of my own life. I was born in 1970. You could have figured that out if I said I was 53. 1970 I was born. And my life partner was also born in 1970. Should I use that term? That's just a little joke. And we were both raised by children of the 50s, like late 40s, but it's the same thing. And we didn't know any other life aside from that. So when we had kids, they were still getting what our parents gave us. And the people who are having kids are the ones who are in that channel. So that our kids don't know what dysfunction is in some way. I mean, they know what, I'm not good with motors. But they don't know what real dysfunction is, or in some way. So we are still living off the fat of those years in ways that we don't even really appreciate or difficult to understand. So yeah, yes, all right, that's enough for that. I'm sorry, I could go on for many questions. I like the yes or no ones, should the father be paid more if he's bad? No, that's easier. Go ahead.
This one's not. So could you explain why you equate feminism with the quote-unquote independent woman, and how are you defining independent, and then are there any other varieties of feminism?
Yes, so that's a great question. It's almost like it's ripped out of my second book, so I'm going to give you a little shtick from chapter 2 of that book. There could be different varieties of feminism. There are people who call themselves, for instance, care feminists or difference feminists, who want to emphasize that the laws and the mores should recognize that women are different from men, and the laws should now be made more in light of female values as opposed to male values. So the great care feminist, her name is Carol Gilligan, and she war is a real problem and capitalism is a problem because they're based on male values, competition and violence, and basically what I'm doing is a kind of controversial thing, which is I'm basically writing her out of feminism. You call yourself a feminist, sorry, you don't qualify on my definition. My definition is feminism is a woman who embraces independence. The last chapter of Simone de Beauvoir's book, the founding book of feminism, is called The Independent Woman. Betty Friedan's kind of groundbreaking American translation of Beauvoir, the last chapter is The Life Plan for an Independent Woman. And the heart of what it means to be an independent woman is, in my view, that you understand your identity independent of God, country, family, or marriage. And the vehicles for the expression of that independence are poetic creation and career-first approaches to life, and kind of a single-minded emphasis on that independence. And I would submit that the compulsory feminist regime grows out of that idea of independence. So that the ways in which care feminism manifests itself in law are like zero. Whereas the ways in which, we'll call it independence feminism, manifests it in law is like covers almost all the variants. It's like almost all of it. So the abortion regime, contraception, all of those are justified in terms of independence. And therefore, I think that's really the feature of what the political understanding of feminism is in our context. And that's the one that informs our sexual constitution. There you go.
In your opinion, how has the sexual contract and compulsory feminism affected the Christian faith?
In lots of different ways. And it's changing. It's changing in a lot of ways. So let me say two things about that. So first of all, just on a very practical level, there's been several studies out in the last 2 years suggesting that for those who are under 30, men are going to church more than females. That kind of matches my experience. It doesn't totally match my experience. But it's historically unprecedented. Like, we've never had congregation roles that have more males than females. In that particular generation, you're having it. And this was, just a couple days ago, the American Enterprise Institute put out this study on a topic, kind of demonstrating these statistics. And they dug deeper, asked young females why they weren't going to church. And they said their pastors were and priests were misogynists who thought they should only be in the house and pregnant. Now, I've sat through a lot of sermons, and part of me wants to say, "Oh, I wish." I'm just kidding. I've never heard anything like that, and like not even something like, perhaps maybe someday you might consider being a mother or a wife. Like, I've never heard anything that strong, and so it's a question about perception. It's a question about perception, and it's leading many churches to see this problem and try to adopt views consistent with feminism in order to fight the growing gender gap between men and women. So I think that's a very interesting dynamic. It's, as I say, historically unprecedented. And then the other thing, and I think this is a very deep something that hasn't been really thought about enough, is that there are certain things that we take for granted about men and women because we have lived in a Christian civilization for so long. So I'll give you one example, but there are many of these examples, like suicide is bad and shameful, or fidelity in marriage is good, or monogamy is normal. Now, when you look historically, these are controversial positions. Like, the Romans were pretty pro-suicide. You guys have seen movies from the 40s from Japan? They're honor cultures. They're kind of pro-suicide. But the Christian civilization has always been anti-suicide. There was old stories, I think they're true, where people would try to kill themselves, they'd fail, and then they'd be taken down to the court, charged for attempted murder, and put to death. That's the idea that your life is not your own. Like, that's a Christian idea. So what happens when you de-Christianize? Just think about it. You're more likely to get more suicide. And like, that's what you see that's kind of happening. It is happening. And because the moral prohibitions that were there. And I think the same thing goes for fidelity in marriage. It's still one of the last kind of bricks in the wall supporting marriage. It's supported widely in America. Like, the idea that you should be faithful to your spouse is supported by almost 80% of Americans. Pretty good, right? Pretty good, almost 80. Wow. I mean, it's down quite a bit from like 96. But if my life partner were here, I would want her to know that I'm among those 78% who still think faithfulness is like a key brick in that wall. But like, why is that changing? Well, were Romans, think about it, were Romans or Greek required to be faithful? Like, these are controversial things. So as there's a retreat from faith, things that you take for granted are like no longer going to be true. Suicide, divorce, like, forget about it. That one's been gone forever. And there's almost a cycle that happens as a result of secularization in these. And it's not really secularization. It's like a different value system fills the void. And that's definitely happening. What you expect women to be and what you expect men to be is changing as a result of this new value system. So what is honored will be different among women than it was in the past. And the kind of behaviors you'll get, you might even get more vulgarity. I know this is hard to believe. It's hard to believe, but you'll probably get more vulgarity out of both men and women. But certainly out of women than you used to get, because it used to be kind of zero. But you'll get new norms, and you're going to get new kinds of people as a result. So it's going to be very interesting. There's nothing more interesting than civilizational transformation. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, the next one's kind of a two-parter. We'll start with part one. Would you agree that feminism and the red pill community are similar in their push for individualism among the sexes?
I'm kind of not aware of what that means. Red pill community? Is that like radical right guys?
I'm guessing that's what they meant.
Is Andrew Tate a red pill guy? Okay. Well, I would understand both of them as part of the post-family, post-marriage culture. What kind of men are you going to get? What kind of women are you going to get in a post-family, post-marriage culture? Right? You're going to get more guys like Andrew Tate. And you're going to get more guys who will kill themselves at Notre Dame because they don't like the direction of France. You're going to get things that you never saw before. And you're going to get like different kinds of women than you got in the past. And there's lots of different manifestations of that. But yeah, I do think that I wouldn't trace them to individualism. I would trace both of them, individualism and these things, to kind of the changing value system that the political community has.
Okay, the second part to that is that alongside this, do you have any thoughts on where the desire for individualism came from or when it became so strong?
Yes, 1150 AD is when it became strong. And where did it come from? It's a mystery. But that's my answer. That's what Tocqueville says in Democracy in America. So I'm just like slavishly adhering to Tocqueville. But that seems right.
Do you think that this outlook change on marriage is because of the rise of individualism and self-focused ideology?
Yes, but like there's just tons of and where does that come from? And where does that come from? You know, that's the infinite regress problem. And that's why I think it's mysterious, precisely why there was a rise of individualism and the desire to conquer nature and the rise of contract thinking. It's like it was articulated by philosophers. They had an effect, but it's also true. I mean, let me approach this in a different way. Like, why did the Reformation happen? Well, it's an interesting question. There were a lot of reformers before Luther. They were burned at the stake. But they had some effect. In England, the Lollards, the Hussites in Austria, they were saying the same things Luther said. So what was it? Was there some decrepit change in the civilization that existed that made what before led to the people being burned at the stake now to like princes listening and saying, oh, I'm going to go with this new guy? And I think that's kind of what we're dealing with on the level of where did individualism come from. Because philosophies of contract have been around for a long time, but they did find the most fruitful soil in which to grow after the Reformation.
They also gave us a second question. They said, how do you defend against the feminist arguments that argue marriage roles are abusive?
I think it's probably always wrong to say that everything that existed before X date was illegitimate, abusive, and oppressive. And the argument that marriage is inherently abusive is one of those arguments that's based on the assumption that before feminism, it was all darkness and oppression. And after feminism, everyone got along great. And just the reality on this is that there's never been more child abuse than there is now. It almost all comes from stepfathers and live-in boyfriends. The amount of abuse that you get from fathers isn't zero, but compared to the other two mounds of abuse that you have, it's like passing small. So I think it's always wrong to say that there was a date before which it was all dark. And I have great respect for the past and would never say that what they were doing was all wrong. And I would never say what we're doing is all wrong either. So that's kind of how I'd approach that.
Okay. Next one. Are you in favor of abolishing all equal protection laws, i.e. the 14th Amendment?
No, I'm not in favor of abolishing the 14th Amendment. I've written a book on this topic. My third book, can I say that? My third book on Reconstruction has 3 chapters on the 14th Amendment. You will find, if you look at that I'm a great fan of Reconstruction. Amendments in the 14th Amendment, I think it completed the Constitution and made it a more perfect document. And here's why. Because before that, states were not held to any standards for equal protection. So let's say you're a president and you do the same thing everyone else does, but the New York Attorney General puts you in court and tries to convict you on an offense that everyone else gets away with. That is a violation of equal protection of the laws. It was perfectly all right before the 14th Amendment. This probably has happened sometime. But the idea of equal protection of the laws is that no matter who you are, the laws apply to you equally. That's what it means. That's not what it has come to mean in some contemporary jurisprudence, but that's a different story. Just a couple more, right? Because Mr. Yenor doesn't have any water right now. Maybe I should just get some water.
Well, he's working on that. Do you think HR has a purpose? Human resources.
Yeah, I mean, let's ask better questions than that. Of course it has a purpose. To oppress, no, I'm sorry. It certainly has a purpose. To dispense benefits.
In your opinion, are today's marriage rates due to no-fault divorce?
I'm not a big fan of that argument, that today's marriage rates are due to no-fault divorce. It's a kind of manosphere argument. The argument goes like this. Because men get hosed in divorce settlements, they aren't entering into marriage as much. And while there may be some evidence, I've never seen really good systematic evidence for that proposition. It seems like it's too intellectual of an argument, really, for me to think that it grows out of people's common experience or guides common experience. It might guide a few people. So I think, for instance, people who've been through divorce and had a tough time generally think, I'm not going to do that again. And so I think divorce leads to such things, but I've never bought, and I don't think there's really good evidence in support of the argument that no-fault divorce has led to fewer marriages.
And the next one's also
It's part of like a larger thing, maybe, but
next one's also about divorce. Would you say that divorce rates were low due to the provisional necessity of having a full family, example, mother, father, and children?
no, I would say divorce rates were low because it was very difficult to get a divorce. And that once you change the laws, boom, you got tons of divorce. The laws shaped practice. Like the number of divorces before 1971 was under, I mean, I'm going to make these numbers up, but I'm a political philosophy guy, so I can do that, right? But the proportions are about right. It was like 100,000 per year in the country to 1.7 million, like after it became kind of widely accepted by the mid-70s. So the law shapes practice on divorce stuff. I'll just throw it here. I'm good. Okay. Couple more.
Okay.
We're trying people's patience, right? What time is it? What time we got?
It's 7:13.
All right, yeah, 7:20. We're over. Unless I got overtime? Overtime?
Is it illegal to hire LDS males because the employer thinks they will be more dependable in order to support larger than average size families?
Say that again.
Is it illegal to hire LDS males because the employer thinks they will be more dependable in order to support larger than average sized families?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, religion is a category when it comes to discrimination is like sewn in with the purpose of businesses. So that if your business has a colorable religious purpose, then you can conduct religious hiring. This was the Hobby Lobby case from a few years ago. So my guess is that if the employer is LDS and the business had a religious purpose, that you could get away with it.
This person said, it is clear that times have changed. They believe the reason generations are waiting longer to have kids, it is because it is harder to quote unquote get ahead and be successful. How should our generation view/solve this challenge?
Well, basic economics will help you solve this challenge. Living separately as two people is a lot more expensive than living together as two people. One bottle of ketchup, one stove, one refrigerator, one car. So marriage is a great anti-poverty program. I mean, I'm not going to defend it on those terms, but like there's plenty of good evidence on these matters. Melissa Kearney's book, The Two-Parent Privilege, kind of wonders about the same question and kind of gives a nice answer to this. So that's what I would go with.
Oh, that is last one.
Oh, well, thank you, everyone, for coming out. Appreciate it.